Welcome to a very special edition of the Crossing Faiths podcast with your hosts, Matt Hawkins, that's me, and John Pinna, my Muslim friend. He's typically from New York or Washington, D.C. recording, but now, this week, he is, I would say live, but this is a podcast, so it's not going to be live, but it's from our quote-unquote field office in Erbil. John Pinna, welcome back to the program.
How you doing, bud? It's good to talk to you.
Glad you were safe and sound in Kurdistan presently.
As far as you know.
As far as I know, you're not speaking under duress at the moment.
Safety word armadillo.
And you have a special guest with us today, which I'm pretty excited about. This inaugurates our first guest, I think, on this Crossing Faiths podcast, even though we've talked about it for some time. Would you care to introduce our guest?
So we're here with Father John Anderson. So, Father John, your actual faith title?
I am a priest of the Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch. I'm in the autonomous North American Antiochian Archdiocese, or Antiochian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese. My hierarch is His Eminence, Metropolitan Joseph.
Okay.
So we can't get guests in America. We have to travel to Erbil, Kurdistan, to get guests to talk to us.
Even though he's based in North America.
Right. It makes no sense, but it just so happens that because we're both here on a humanitarian assessment, we arrived at different dates, but because we're co-populating our Erbil at the same time, or Kurdistan at the same time, we were able to spend some time working together on doing an assessment of what's with the current environment in Kurdistan, sure. And as a result of the recent unpleasantness that's happening in Syria as a result of the war over there and the conflict. So, and we've spent some time traveling through Kurdistan. Had a number of plans that had to be put aside, but we're here now because we are in Erbil at the same time, able to collaborate on this show.
Great. Yeah. Father Anderson, thank you for making the trip, number one. And number two, thank you for taking a little bit of time out of your schedule at probably a very late night right now to talk with us. Where are you from originally? We got your official title and your church affiliation, but tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from, and what do you spend your days doing in your particular role?
Well, like John, I'm a native New Yorker. We disagree on the vocabularies that New Yorkers must use to be authentically New York. But other than that, we're New Yorkers. So you got two New Yorkers here, so people might question the diversity of opinion on this show.
And it's worthwhile to say that we are collaborators at the International Legislative Roundtable, yes. And that's how we know each other. And we spend quite a bit of time in Washington, so it is a special kind of moment for us to be overseas, interacting together and spending some time. And the city is big enough for the both of us. We just found that out.
The city is big enough for the both of us, and all the wonderful people who inhabit Kurdistan make it big enough for the both of us.
Yeah. A lot of people don't realize that the amazing community that's here is multi-faith, collaborative, cooperative, and largely unknown.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why we thought this was appropriate to chat with you.
Yeah. Today. So, Father Anderson, other than collaborating on international religious freedom, what does your weekly, day-to-day work look like?
Well, I do a few things. A lot of pastoral care, a lot of pastoral counseling.
Okay.
The Orthodox Church may be heard of in the Western world, Western Christendom, but it's largely unknown. And for those who know it, most of them put a template on it that it really doesn't fit.
Yeah.
And it makes then engaging the Orthodox Christians even more confusing because they think they understand the Orthodox Church and they don't.
Can you give us like a 30-second schism? What's the difference between what it was the Orthodox, it was the Greek, or not the Greek, it was the Roman Catholic Church, and it broke away in the schism.
Right. Okay, so there was a Roman Empire. Constantine eventually made Christianity the official faith of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire.
And that's what the dates of that are about.
313 was the Edict of Milan, and I think it was a little later that it became the official religion. Constantine himself, as was a common practice for some people who had had rather colorful lives, waited to the end of his life to get baptized,
right,
hoping that all his sins would be washed away at baptism.
That's my camp.
Okay,
right?
that's John's camp. And then at one point the empire was split into 4 parts, but then Rome was sacked by the Vandals, and the Western Roman Empire kind of snuffed out. But the Eastern Roman Empire, so the Roman Empire, the remnant, still persisted. We call it the Byzantine Empire, but that's an incorrect term. The West was more Latin-oriented, and the East was more Greek-oriented, Oriental in terms of culture, things like that. And so the West, because of various issues, and the East lost a lot of communication. And as we're learning today,
became like isolated monasteries,
I said, communities, you name it.
Whereas it was consolidated in Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire.
Right, and the Roman Empire in the East held on technically until 1453, when Constantinople was overrun, and then it was snuffed out. And then the patriarchs became, under the Ottomans, the heads of the Rum Millet, which are the people of Rome.
And patriarchs are the governing
senior
people
right,
of the church.
Yeah. Prior to that, they didn't have.
There's 5 patriarchs in the Russian Orthodox. Yeah, in the Russian Orthodox Church. And
well, Russia came later.
Yeah, but
so the 5 patriarchates would be: Rome was given preference, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Jerusalem. Yeah. And Rome was number 1, and then with the filioque, really it was used in the coronation. It was insisted upon by Charlemagne, and around 800 the West started using it.
Yes, sure.
They actually used it for a good reason. I think it came out of the Council of Toledo in Spain. The filioque was added on to help defend the person of God, so to speak, in the person of Jesus Christ.
So why is the Russian, or why is the Orthodox Church really the true church, and all these other Christian churches shouldn't really be around it?
Well, I'm not sure we would say that, because
why are they the best? No, I'm kidding.
Pin is always trying to seed disunity.
You know, if we're not talking about faith, and John, it's like, which is best, a Mercedes or an Audi? You know, it's just like, so it's different, and it's different in many, many ways. And I'll give you an example, part of the confusion. So there's a schism, okay? So roughly from 1054, because that's when basically everybody dates it. But some of the Orthodox really didn't cut communion with the Pope in Rome, while remaining completely Orthodox till the 13th century. But you have the Great Schism, and then you have issues that lead to the Protestant Reformation. And some of the Wittenberg theologians, I think it was Patriarch Jeremiah II of Constantinople, write him, and they want his opinion on all these very Protestant questions. And
give what's a Protestant question?
Well, I mean, faith or works,
buying indulgences
and indulgences and things like that.
That's what I think of.
Yeah, and basically the long and the short, since this is a podcast, is Jeremiah II basically wrote back and go talk to Rome, because I really don't even understand what you're saying, because these aren't our theological perspectives.
Right.
So for instance, like the great argument, faith or works. Well, why is there a dichotomy? Why isn't 2 sides of the same coin?
Yeah.
How can you have faith if you're not living it? Faith isn't an intellectual apprehension of an idea. Faith is something that gives you life.
Did you two talk before we got on this podcast?
We did not. I promise.
All the time. This is Matthew's doling out these faith cards all the time in the podcast.
Right. Well,
so I feel like you're just reinforcing him, and this is a.
So you see, you're making a false dichotomy. I'm not reinforcing faith.
I'm false dichotomizing.
You're reinforcing that there's actually this separation between faith and works.
I'm not taking a position.
Not intentionally, but it's like, when you push a bad pizza place. Okay, you're trying to do good, but you're doing bad. Okay, so we love you. So my point is that there are a lot of the basic way to look at it is this. A lot of Western Christian theology goes for precision. It likes precision.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Language for precision, definition, things like that. And the Orthodox have always been more of this kind of thing like, well, it's God. Who am I, a sinner, to really understand God?
Yeah.
Right.
So how can I put all these labels on God? There's some labels, so to speak, we can put on God, but we can't limit God.
That's a very Muslim precept. It's like, as someone that's imperfect, as someone who's supposed to be submitting to Allah. Well, who are we to try to put the precision on it? And that's where we get muddled into all these different things, where you get people trying to be precise, like your Muslim Brotherhood, your Wahhabis, your Salafis, who are always saying, Deobandis, who are always saying, no, we interpret religious texts, we're defining what a Muslim is, and let me tell you how to do it. Yeah. So it's the same type of situation.
Father John, let me ask you this. Given what you've said about that and the desire for precision in theology in the West, that's a really good way of putting it. Would you say something like maybe your tradition is a little more comfortable with the paradoxes of Scripture, whereas Western folks in more Western traditions, we because of the desire for precision, we're less comfortable with paradoxes that we see?
Absolutely. And I'll give you that. There's a thing called mystagogy, which is the study of mystery. And unfortunately, mysterion, the term that's often used in the Orthodox churches from the Greek, gets translated into English in the word mystery. And then we think about things like, novels that are murder mysteries.
Yeah.
That's not what they're talking about. What they're talking about is things that are unknowable or unknown to us because we are creatures and we are sinful creatures.
Right.
And therefore, we're never going to...
Give me an example of the paradox. So from Muslim listeners, what we say the paradox, what is that?
Okay.
Give me just a simple example.
So here's a simple example. Okay. I'm sitting next to John, JT, whatever, Pinna, however you want to call him, Brother John, as he's been called tonight. And somebody will go, do you know him? Right. Really, I should answer, no. Right. I don't know him. Okay. I've spent time with him. I've done this and that. We traveled to Kurdistan, et cetera, et cetera. But do I know him? No, I don't know him. Well, why is that? You spent all that time with him. Well, there are two major reasons why I don't know him. One, I'm limited. So knowledge would assume that I have an objective understanding of who he is. Okay? I know him. Again, that precision. I know him. But the other is that everything about him is completely knowable. Okay? And then the only person who's going to know him that way is God. Yeah. Does that make sense?
I understand. Yeah.
Because knowledge in that regard would, so we're in the present moment.
Right. It has to define, it has to be, it's not that you're trying to bound it by time and space. Right. And I've existed in multiple realms, and it's and evolved up to now, and will extend beyond this time theoretically, if you don't murder me on this podcast. And then
well, and I'll give you an example. It's going to sound absurd, but it's accurate. If I know John and I know John's pancreas, right. I hope to never see John's pancreas, and John doesn't want me to see his pancreas because then something bad is happening to John.
Just as long as you're not looking out the duodenum, that's the bad of the organs of the body.
So this precision in language, and there's nothing wrong with it in theory, okay? But this precision in language, and then the other side, getting too hazy and going, well, it's all mystery, that's leads to baloney too.
Right.
But on the faith and work side and the precision and the mystery, I'll simply say this. The man himself says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Okay? That is a matter of faith which cannot be lived without works.
How come you, the evangelicals and the Orthodox Church don't get along? This is the same stuff you tell me all the time. What's going on here?
That's a great question, John.
No, I'll just be honest. I mean, this is word for word. This is verbatim. This is 10 years of our relationship. This guy's saying the same thing. So why are you guys?
And we've never
What's
met.
the problem between
I've got nothing, no problem with evangelical.
the evangelical? So what's the evangelical take on Orthodox Christians?
I think
I don't want to back you into a corner, but
Father John may have a different answer for that. I think it's just in part a distance of history, and it's a lack of knowledge and a lack of interaction.
well, maybe we can start a new socialization by doing this. Maybe start a new trend here by having this podcast. Maybe there'll be an evangelical Orthodox revival. It's
a lack of interaction. There's a lot of history there. There's also, I think, most of our differences will probably come down to differences in ecclesiology, or what we believe ought to be the structure of the church. That's probably where a lot of our disagreement lies.
Well, would it be fair to say that the problems come from the Calvinists?
John,
I'm going to throw them under the bus.
So I always bash the Calvinists. I'm always going to bring them.
And I'm going to put snow tires in the bus, okay? Because the idea of God predestining people, that's not a loving God. Plain and simple. An American cultural Christianity, I'm not talking about a particular faith group, American cultural Christianity is shaped radically by the Calvinists. I'll give you another country shaped by the Calvinists, are the Dutch. I lived in the southern Netherlands in Limburg, and very heavily populated by, at least formerly, by Catholics, but a lot of their cultural behaviors were were Calvinists, and they'd even tell you that.
Yeah.
That they were influenced by the Calvinists. America, it's Catholicism is very Calvinist in many ways, you name it. And Calvinism really doesn't leave any room for error because God's picking certain people.
Precise.
It's very precise.
Am I wrong? So, I mean, what do you think about the Calvinist comment?
Are you asking me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, I think Father Anderson's right in the acknowledgement of the influence of Calvinism, in particular that what I think we as Protestants read Calvin as focusing on that issue for not really the broad scope of his theology, but it's in there. And I think what was recognized and labeled as quote unquote Calvinism, I think in more recent years is a lot of folks are trying to rename that as more reformed, because a lot of Calvin's followers after him got even more specific and more narrow. So successors like Beza, more systematized, even more rigidly and more precisely some of Calvin's ideas than maybe even Calvin did himself. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And then, and I'm an American. My family's been there for generations. I love my country. I spent decades in the military.
Father Anderson's family they're like part of the original Pilgrims.
Yeah.
They came. They're the people that started the buckles and hat trends in America.
I'm sure.
Which was a major fashion statement for several decades.
But your family came in on the boat.
On the Mayflower. That's true.
Wow.
Yeah, that's true.
That's cool.
And I'm direct descendant of John Robinson, who actually died in Leiden, Holland, who is their pastor, who took them out of England, brought them to the Netherlands, because at that time the Netherlands was more religiously tolerant.
How outrageous is this guy?
That's pretty fascinating. Right?
So, but he didn't make it over. His son Isaac did a few years after the Mayflower. So the Robinsons didn't make it over on the Mayflower, but other ancestors of mine did.
Okay. So this guy's embedded. He's old school, long history in America.
All right. So we'll come back to some of the multi-faith conversation, because I know there's a nugget that Father Anderson will be especially well placed to answer one of John's questions that you've had for many episodes now. But we've got to get to what you guys are seeing in Kurdistan, why you're there, and what our listeners can glean from your experience right now. So you and Father Anderson have gone on something of a site assessment to figure out what the ramifications are in the United States change in policy towards Syria, namely pulling troops out of the region. And what are you seeing down there?
Well, I'll say initially when we made this trip, decided on it, started buying airplane tickets, there was discussion, not of the U.S. pulling out troops at the time, but there were discussions about issues, and we were looking at potentially looking at certain types of refugee populations in Syria in terms of how to help with humanitarian aid, because I've got a NGO, a 501c3 called St. Nicholas Freedom Group. And John is helping me on a lot of issues there because we do anti-human trafficking and religious freedom.
And this is all pre the Turkish invasion. This is months in the making. We were talking about going and interacting with, and so Father John had made the sort of effort to kind of say, okay, I'm going to come out and do this. And then we met up earlier this week because we didn't come together. And the idea is that it morphed into okay, now let's meet up. Let's do a collaborative site assessment of what's going on in country, conduct some engagement, and then also now, because of the changing environment, let's see how the war is affecting some of the really profound positive qualities in Kurdistan. For example, you have a multi-faith community where you have Sunni Shia, which is, your Muslim side, your Christian groups and your Yazidis and all the religious minorities therein. So your Buddhist, your Jewish community, Zoroastrians and other religious communities who are flourishing here, collaborating here, living here, and no one knows about it.
No one knows about it. Saddam tried to basically wipe out diversity, and they survived.
And they survived through collaborating and helping each other. They didn't survive by isolating themselves. They integrated in a way. They were able to maintain their religious identities and then become strong and as a collective. And something that's really profound here is in the ministry of, what's it called?
Well, the Ministry of Religion, but we met with the Director of Coexistence.
Right. In the Ministry of Religion, each religion has an office in the ministry. I don't know any other country that has that. I mean, they might, the ministry might appoint a rabbi or a sheikh or a patriarch or something, but to have actual authority and an office in the ministry so that their communities can have direct access to the government's services and policy making is unique and profound. And I don't think that the Kurds get enough credit for how they interact with the religious communities and the success they have within their multi-faith engagement. I think it's very, it's not a secret that's kept on purpose. Although there is some difficulty between Arabs and Kurds, but that's an ethnic issue rather than a religious issue. So I don't know. What would you agree?
What's interesting is in this part of the world, a lot of the countries are, perhaps except Lebanon, religious appellation, Republic of. Right. And the Kurds, by trying to work with the religious diversity in the best aspects of human development, understand the need for freedom of conscience. And freedom of religion is the basis for freedom of conscience. And it's out of those freedoms that we Americans hold so dearly, that everything else unfolds. If you don't have real freedom, you don't have real rule of law, for instance.
And this is a Muslim country.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm going to back you up on that because we just talked about the diversity. I think this is an exceptional Muslim country because of the fact that you do have these strong, ancient diverse communities. I mean, I don't think we have to go back 1,300 years to find that maybe it wasn't a Muslim community or areas weren't Muslim. Salamania, and I apologize to all the Kurds out there if I just butchered that name of the city, but they have a large Zoroastrian population. Yeah. And, I haven't heard of Zoroastrians going on the rampage and committing religious genocide.
Well, and here we have like I said, a Sunni country, and I think that this is where we get into a difference between the sects in Islam, and we talk about I mentioned some of them earlier in the podcast. Your Wahhabi, Salafi, your Deobandis, who have these sects that are very prescriptive and precise, like we were talking about earlier, on what is interpreting religious text, defining what a Muslim is, and then moving forward on that, and then taking one step further and going, by the way, there shouldn't be any other religious groups around, right? Because we are the sole authority on religion, and therefore you must do this. Either become part of the community, or we are going to figure out a way to dispel you. And so this is the struggle that we always talk about internally with the Muslim community. But I think that there's an opportunity here to see a matrix that is working and ancient and collaborative and current.
And what we've done and what we continue to do is to encourage the Kurdish people to look at the strengths. They've been through a lot over the last decades. The whole reign of Saddam Hussein, post-Saddam Hussein, ISIS, you name it.
Well, look, they border Iran. They're bordering a war zone right now. They've got the turmoil of what's happening in Iraq right now, and there's an amazing moment. One of the reasons why we're having this podcast is that Father John was his NGO coming out to do the assessment. I'm here collaborating with him. He had meetings set up. What did he do? He invited me to his meeting tonight with the ministry. He wasn't waiting to say, "Oh, I'm going to have this meeting. It's mine." In a collaborative, multi-faith spaces, we're here together. Why don't you come to my meeting? And they were shocked, weren't they?
They were shocked. But and I'll simply say
not in a bad way, but there was
they're pleasantly surprised. But it goes back to Orthodox theology in that I'm limited, and anybody who knows me well will say extremely. But the reality is that regardless of experience or education or whatever, I bring my own very limited perspective, and so it is very good to have somebody there who brings another perspective. The other part from the Orthodox theology perspective is there is no one I meet that God loves less than me. Meaning they're all created in God's image, fashioned after his likeness. And to quote the man himself again, for me, Jesus Christ, who am I to judge?
Father John, I'd
judge any of them.
Yeah. Father Anderson, I want to focus on one thing I picked up from something you just said. You said it's about your faith, right? So it's from within.
Yes, absolutely.
You're doing multi-faith engagement, not just because it's a nice thing or from our Western, post-Enlightenment context, we think everybody ought to get along. You're drawing on theology and resources from within your own tradition to engage the religious other. Do I read that correctly?
That is, and I'll simply say this: in Christianity, there is no group that understands multi-faith engagement and multi-faith living better than the Orthodox Christians, whether they're Oriental or Eastern. Nobody.
Yeah, and as somebody who it's not by accident that the two of us have collaborated at the round table, and now that we're here, we're teaming up while we have the time to do so, because both of our faiths demand we move forward and step outside of not just our communities to make sure that we engage appropriately. And the profound nature of the two of us walking into the ministry today was a show of positive force in that direction and unity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just like this podcast with the two of us, Matthew, even though I give you a hard time.
Even though
you Calvinist.
Yeah. Even though John tries to set me up every episode.
There you go. Just more. Remember, it's more than the bread of bread and more than the wine of wine.
I don't know what does that mean?
That's from John Calvin's Institutes. I didn't read it in the original French.
Didn't you sit in the chair? Did you sit in the Calvin chair?
Don't come after me.
Didn't you sit in the Calvin chair, Matthew?
I did not sit in the Calvin chair. My parents, I know people who went and saw it.
Okay.
You can go. You can look at it. I'm not sure if they allow people to sit in it, but you can go look at it and take pictures of it.
Well, as long as it's not in an outhouse,
right?
Right. Yeah, it must be one of those rigid chairs that squeaks a lot.
Well,
I don't know if it squeaks. It certainly did not look like a comfortable chair.
Yeah.
So would you? So I think it's Father John is much more qualified to do the download on what's your assessment of the environment here, as the conflict. So as you see it from a pre-conflict, current conflict, and then from the post, and what do and so good, the bad, the ugly, the risks, what's going on, really, some of the positive things that are happening. Some of the outcomes from our conversation with the ministry. What are you thinking right now? Is an assessment? Is it a critical time? Do we have? Should we be very concerned? What do you think is the core of how you would describe what's going on right now and how it's affecting the community?
I would say that if the world were wise, which unfortunately we're human beings, that's not our greatest asset typically, they would look at this area of the planet, and they would look at it probably over the last 50 to 70 years, and they would say, how are they hanging on? How do they make this happen? How do they believe that there's a future? The Kurdish word, and please forgive me for mistranslating it, for hope is hiwa. How do they maintain hope?
Hiwa is hope, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I would say it's the shami kebab. They make really, really good shami kebab.
Here we go.
It's delicious.
He's going off the deep end. I'd like to say it's a jet lag.
It's delicious. They make the shami kebabs are at least 6 inches longer than normal shami kebabs, and they are delicious.
The food's exceptional.
And the naan.
Do you want me to answer the question? Are we gonna? Or is this
well, the naan has seeds in it.
Is this turning into a cooking show?
But it has seeds.
We talk cooking.
The sesame seeds, they're delicious.
But then I want to talk about sushi.
Okay. Well, I just think that their food might.
Their food is excellent. Okay.
It might be a factor.
They're more to the Kurds than cuisine.
You have to understand that part of Pinna's multi-faith strategy is cuisine, and especially breakfast foods. So
getting back to the seriousness, the gravity of the question is this: what nation, what political party, what people, what faith thinks that they're so correct? Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying there's not truth. Okay, I'm not saying there's not truth, and I'm not saying there's not a God. But what I've experienced my whole life is there is a loving God. Okay. It's not my middle name is Edwards, so I'm John Edwards. Certainly not Jonathan Edwards. It's not sinners in the hands of an angry God. Because if it's sinners in the hands of an angry God, then God is just a supernatural bully. Okay? Because if we stand back and we look at our own lives, probably by somewhere between age 20 and 25, we realize that we're our own worst enemy, typically. Okay? That our sinfulness, or our harmatia in Greek, not hitting the mark, so to speak. We don't really use the concept of sin the way it is in the West, and we certainly don't have a concept of sin nature the way there is to some degree from a Calvinist perspective in the West. But how great am I that I want the world made in my image? And I'll throw that out to anybody. And how great is any government that the world should be governed by it, or a people, or a faith? And being a descendant of the Pilgrims who were fleeing a state with a church, church as state is always flawed, because absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's something I've always said about Christian clergy: you need to keep three things away from Christian clergy if you want them to be Christian. You keep money away from them. You keep them poor. You keep real estate away from them, which is part of poverty. And you keep weapons. Jesus had none of those three. And then they're much more apt to be able to listen to the call of God, because Jesus came into the world without those three, and he left by his own choice, not in terms of being crucified, but by willing to be crucified, because he didn't use that kind of earthly power to try and gain what he was trying to gain.
Right.
So, getting back to the question in a more concrete way, all of us, unless we take a real assessment at how we're living our lives as human beings, okay, and we can pick a topic, climate change, diversive politics, where we're no longer capable of living and listening to each other, totalitarian regimes, communism, uncontrolled capitalism, whatever it is, we're going to be in the same situation that the Kurds are in, okay? But I'm not sure we're going to be like the Kurds in their ability to look forward, hold on to the good parts of their past, look forward and believe that they can create a meaningful future. Because in many respects, all of our immersions, our baptisms, and our own ego make us shallower, because somehow, and this is also from the Calvinism, I call the theology of Job's friends. In America, we have this kind of attitude that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. Well, Job was righteous, and he went through hell.
Yeah.
Okay. And he would not curse God and die. And people can sit there and say, well, everything was restored to him. Not the trauma he went through. The trauma he went through was not something that was restored to him. The loss of children, things like that. The Kurds are going through this. The Kurds are going through this with their neighbors. They're going through themselves. And they're still able to look towards the future without having, if you will, not in the political sense, but perhaps in the ideological sense, a totalitarian vision of what the future must be. They realize their future is predicated on the fact that they have to be open to something greater than themselves, open to love of neighbor, okay, open to the possibility of listening. Any sense of real dialogue in the United States, how many years has it been since we've seen that in politics?
Well, even with faith communities, it's still difficult.
Yeah.
There's still, within the Christian community, we're talking about how you got the Orthodox and the evangelicals, the Protestants don't communicate. Within the Muslim community, we collaborate back and forth, but it's only been relatively recently that we've collaborated at a profound level because of the chokehold that what the Wahhabis have had on engagement in Washington. All the NGOs, the top 5 NGOs, were all funded by Wahhabis and Muslim Brotherhood, and they controlled the narrative, and they didn't want to talk to anybody else in the Muslim community. Right. Now that's gone. That's the last 5 years. That's diluted, and now there's much more diversity in the Muslim community. But I think it's, when it comes to here, there's something extraordinary happening, and that's been happening for centuries. That's still in existence, and it's ancient. But it's also current, and it's profound in how it's been operationalized at the not at the governmental level, where, like you said, the ministry has offices of every faith group, and then they're collaborating, respecting the holidays. There's all kinds of other stuff going on, and they're talking about the future. As crazy as all their environment is, and with Iran and this, and Syria and everything else. So, and then Father John's coming out here, and like I said, here we are together talking with you about this, and I would say the site assessment is positive.
It's hopeful.
It's hopeful, with the caveat that this community is completely under siege, and there's a word for it. It's called surrounded. Yeah. So there's a military term. It's surrounded, and there's it's interesting to see other communities celebrate what wins they have in the multi-faith perspective, but this is a daily, everyday operational thing where these communities are flourishing. Yeah. And not only that, they're letting NGOs come in here to help in Syria, to conduct forays into Syria and help the communities there.
I can say it this way. Something I tried to teach my children is life is a team sport. Mm-hmm. Okay. In America, for a long time, culturally, we pushed radical individualism, which is a myth, because what formed the United States was actually not a bunch of radical individuals. It was a group of people compelled by a belief in their faith to come up on a foreign shore. Okay, there were no cities, there were no buildings, there were no social programs, there was nothing at all. and they encountered people who were here, and then in certain contexts, not to go too deep, they didn't handle them properly, but in other ways they tried to. But they weren't worried about being radical individuals. What they were worried about is taking care of each other.
Yeah.
Okay. And the Kurds, through all of this, are still, and it's always a struggle. So when I say what I'm about to say, it is not a ding on the Kurds. The Kurds are struggling with this idea. In Orthodox Christianity, we talk about ascesis. Life is a struggle. If you're not struggling, then you can guarantee you're doing something wrong. You're completely embedded in evil, because trying to do good in the world is always a struggle. The Kurds are trying to struggle through this situation. They're very inspirational. The United States, our culture, we need to stop being afraid of pain and death, okay? And we need to embrace the struggle to be better than we are.
Yeah.
And that's always been a challenge to every. It's something the United States, Americans need to do, instead of running away from all the problems, running away from the pain. And the Kurds, what they're doing is, with everything they've got going on, and I'm a licensed mental health clinician, the Kurds, if they could, they can't. If they could, they need a couple of decades to recover from what they went through.
Yeah.
But instead, they're opening themselves up.
Yeah.
And in the Orthodox Church, we call it kenosis. They're pouring themselves out to help other people. They're helping other people, and somebody may go, well, they're Kurds too. Well, technically, the way the modern world looks at things, they're Syrians. Okay?
Yeah.
But it's not just Kurds that are coming across. It's not just Kurds that are affected by the crisis in Syria. It's Christians and other groups. And they're coming here too. Okay? And still in the midst of all that, still in the midst of their very recent history of violence and oppression, ISIS, Saddam Hussein, you name it. I mean, there are a pair of, exceptional forces of evil in human history. They are still trying to navigate to a place where there's freedom of conscience, where they just respect all human beings and they have hope.
Yeah.
And that is, certainly worthy. Far from perfect in execution, as are we, or any country, but that is certainly worthy of our contemplation.
Well, here we are. It's amazing that we talk about a lot of stuff in policy, you and I, Matthew, and we're able to right now, because of this moment of Father John being here, me being here, and us being able to take the time to talk about this, to be in country, in theater, talking about a community that we've recently been engaged with on multiple levels, and now we're it makes, with a multi-faith space that we cherish so dearly, but also frustrates us so much, because it's given a current and example that is within not only within the news cycle of all these events that are happening. And we're not talking about this from Washington. We're in Erbil right now. Sitting together, sitting there going, what's going on at 12 midnight, because we're plus 7 hours. And the power just went off.
Which is a daily event here. If we did in the United States, probably 90% of our population would stroke, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, and across the room is a gentleman whose team is in Syria right now, helping with humanitarian aid,
medical aid,
and we're sitting here going, we have sitting here, wondering, how their safety is and everything else,
and they're a multi-faith, multi-ethnic team.
Yeah. So and helping multi-faith, multi-ethnic victims, and people, persecuted.
And I'll simply saying this: in the midst of all that, being generous enough and thoughtful enough to provide us hospitality.
Yeah.
And which is one of the most ancient forms of actionable good, if you will. And the Kurds are masters of it.
Yeah.
And so are our guests.
And in a context where no one would blame them if they said, sorry, we got some stuff going on right now.
Yeah. Right? Most people go, sorry, too busy. And they'd be right to say it.
Yeah. We're good. I thank you, gentlemen, for bringing this story and these insights to us and our listeners, and I really appreciate it. Before we go, though, I know we want to, there's been a question on John's mind about some of the Christian tradition that has come up multiple times. And Father Anderson,
you just want to put these to bed, don't you? You just want to, I can tell you just, we were talking about the Jesus abs for a long time.
And Father John is uniquely positioned and knowledgeable to give a informed answer, more so than John's speculation or me as a Baptist to go look up the reason for this. So John, go ahead, get it out of your system, and ask your question.
No, I didn't know you asked the question. I don't remember what the question is.
You know what the question is. The question is from John. Why is it that the display of Jesus on a cross, he is frequently, if not always, depicted as having very visible abs, six-pack?
The six-pack.
John finds that fascinating. I confess that as a Protestant, as a Baptist, I am not part of the tradition that displays Jesus in that manner, because our crosses tend to not have Christ on the cross. But someone from Father Anderson's tradition has a really insightful answer for why that depiction looks like that.
So the Jesus on the cross, the Jesus abs, in shape, the original six-pack.
All right, so I'll explain something. So here we're talking about abs because they have a cultural value in American culture. Okay, so let's think about that for a moment.
Right.
All right. That shows how deeply culture, for better or worse, I'm not saying one way or the other, affects our perspectives on faith. Okay. So I'll simply say, in a lot of American portrayals of Jesus, he is what I call the holy football player. Okay, he's well fed. He's going to the gym. There's a particular image I think of where there's a little girl. He's either standing around her, or she's sitting on his lap, and her hands. He's got his hands, and he's got a garment that it looks like it's kind of off-white. So you imagine it's probably woven linen that covers his shoulders. His whole abdomen, everything else. Completely appropriate. And, he's probably like 250, he goes to the gym 5 days a week, takes 2 days off, and he's probably eating like 4,000 calories a day. And his hair is almost, it's light brown. His eyes are blue. His skin is almost as light as mine. And I've got, Irish skin. So, it's, there's not a lot of pigment here. And the reality of who Jesus Christ is and what the Orthodox Church tries to do is we try to be historically accurate in our artistic portrayals of Christ, his mother, and the other saints. Saints being, in the Greek word, agios, or male or female, holy. Because there are a lot of words that we use in English and other Western languages that really don't translate to some of the original words used in Christianity. Because Christianity, the first major languages it was translated in or lived in was Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek, later Latin, and now we talk about it in the Bible in English. So to go to answer this question, Jesus was Jewish. He was a manual laborer, okay, and he fasted a lot. When we talk about fasting, we do a 24-hour fast. We've got a country, or the whole of Western culture, most of the world is morbidly obese. Okay, our excess is our problem. Okay, Jesus fasted. He really fasted.
What's really fasting? What does that mean?
Really fasting isn't just restraining ourselves in consumption of food. Fasting, what fasting does, pick it anything you fast from, it's to remind us that we're dependent on God.
Right. In Islam, it's a discipline,
It is a discipline.
So it's, when you fast, you're not just fasting from food, you're fasting from sex, you're fasting from everything. And so you hold back on that. I fast between meals.
Yeah.
So it's
a fast between meals, But it's not just, food you're fasting from. The idea is to help us center our perspective of our life on the fact that we're completely dependent on God and God's love and mercy, and therefore we are called to be loving and merciful. Okay? and like our hosts are being, not just to us, by the way. I didn't mean that just in a self-serving term. But so Jesus is a hardcore manual laborer. He fasts a lot. Okay, if you ever look at manual laborers, okay, most of them are, if they're working hard, and he's only in his 30s, right? They're in good shape, right? And you figure he's doing, to use modern terms, calorie deprivation. And as Matthew pointed out, he's probably not well hydrated. He probably doesn't have a little Nalgene bottle or whatever. He's running around with all the time.
No Yeti bottles.
Or Dasani, and producing plastic and throwing it around. So that's why he looks the way he looks. There is this need.
So he's on the cross, and he's fasted, and he's been working, the carpentry gig.
Remember, shortly before this, he was in the desert for 40 days, 40 nights. What was he doing?
Being tempted.
Yeah, but what else was he doing?
Shaitan. What?
He was fasting.
He was fasting. That's right.
Yeah,
and that business.
And around here, the desert's everywhere. And Egypt, you go to some of these places, we think we know what desert is, but we try.
You say it's an accurate depiction of a fasting hard worker.
I can't say that. What I'm saying is, in the Orthodox tradition, we try to be historically accurate.
Right. So because iconography in the Orthodox Church.
Yes.
Right. So Catholics have a different situation, right? So
they have iconography too. So.
Right. Okay. So I mean, that's a satisfying answer.
Right. Is that good, John? Is that fair?
It makes sense, doesn't it?
It does to me. I actually had never delved into that question, so I've learned a lot from Father Anderson. I appreciate it.
So I'm gonna, if I may,
doling out lessons
in the Eastern Church,
religious
we go by
lessons,
first names. In the Latin Church, they go by last names. So it's Father John.
Okay,
it's interesting.
I'll take it.
No, and I don't mean it correctively. I mean it lovingly.
I appreciate
it. Church,
I was just trying to parse between having two Johns on the other end of the microphone.
There's Brother John and Father John, or as we were saying before, I call John Halal John and Rotten John. And he loves that.
I'm going to call him Halal John from now on.
In my faith, so
right. But in the West, for instance, the only person who uses their first name in conjunction with the pastoral title is the Pope.
All right.
Pope Francis.
That works.
But that's the difference. But what I'd simply say about the Jesus abs, what's really amazing is the man himself, not just his abs. So this goes to this precision disease. It's in the Western mind, Muslim, Orthodox, Christian, Protestant, or atheist. Let's look at the man himself, his life, and what he did.
Yeah.
That's all.
So
well put, Father John.
Okay, so it was appreciative because we had rocked into this conversation, and I'd asked him about the abs. He went. He said it was fasting, so that's why we brought this thing up. It was amazing, So I think we satisfied that.
Sounds like a very reasonable answer.
Yeah, which you're going to be happy about.
Yeah, like it.
You must be. That's a win for you. It's a big win for you on this one.
I think we both win. You answered. We got an answer for your curiosity, and I get to stop hearing you ask about it.
Well, but admittedly, you didn't know. You had no answer.
It's true.
And you're my go-to guy.
Well, I wasn't going to fake an answer, and Father John is well qualified and has provided an insightful answer.
And so we appreciate. It's our first interview with a. The Orthodox Church, and Father John is we're in our what's it called, our satellite office in Erbil, Kurdistan,
our mobile field office.
Yeah. So we're crossing faiths, bringing faith all over, faith conversation all over the world.
Parting words, one from each of you. What you want folks in America back home to hear about your current experience. What do you want them to, other than the entirety of our conversation, what do you want them to see and take away from what you see on the ground in Kurdistan?
Just like faith without works isn't, caring without action isn't. If we're going to care, we need to make it actionable, concrete, and fulfilled the objectives. This is a planet full of people, and America, we take a lot, we give a lot, but we can give a lot more.
Yeah.
And we have a responsibility for everything that we take, that we give back. So I would simply encourage America and her allies to do right by these people in this horrible situation.
Yeah. Well put.
I agree. I think that from my perspective, I have a tendency to internalize things a little bit. We talk a lot at the International Vision Roundtable and other and in Washington about policy and like to project our value system. And as a Muslim, I always get very nervous about that because religious freedom is part of the Islamic tradition. It's inherently embedded. It's very not inherently. It's explicitly embedded in the theology. We're just having this internal struggle with Wahhabism. But I think that, I don't know anything about Kurdistan. It's not my subject matter expertise. But part of the reason why I've taken the time out of my current agenda to spend time not only with helping Father John and this assessment while I can, we took this time to do the podcast because in a very, I think in a very humble way, we're able to sit down and chat a little bit about our observations in an objective way because it isn't our subject matter. It isn't my subject matter expertise. And we were able to take a real honest and objective assessment of what's going on here. Now we know the international development world and security, and we understand all those components,
Sure.
But we're able to walk into without any really sort of prejudice and assess what's going on. And that's faith in action.
Yeah.
And the fact that Father John felt compelled to include me in the meeting today when he didn't have to. And not only that, the community here for us to interact with them in a very thoughtful manner, and take the time to share with us what's going on while they're under siege is on all fronts. It shows the collaborative and positive nature of faith interaction and faith collaboration. And I think that's a profound moment. But honestly, the conflict that's going on right now, I don't see a purpose in it, and I'm not sure what the end game is for all sides and all parties. But I do know that the Kurds need assistance and support right now, and from the faith communities, and that means not being indifferent, which is I think
absolutely
that Father John was mentioning. And I'm happy that we were able to include you in this from Tennessee, because you're gonna. What are you going to do? You're going to edit this. You're going to take the time to figure it out and then post it and all this other stuff, which is no less profound than what we're doing right now.
Wow.
It's absolutely needed, and it's absolutely essential that three faiths. I would argue three faiths are collaborating on this with the extended community that's here,
yeah.
and to make something like this happen and hopefully get it out to the rest of the world.
And I will simply say this, as the hosts have shown, I'm just speaking as a Christian, we are not Christian if we are indifferent.
We're not Muslims if we're indifferent. So just following the fundamentals of Islam is not the way to go. So you have to act. And that means there has to be some kind of action associated with your faith that is outside of yourself, that means outside of your job, outside of your family, outside of your community. It needs to happen. So, and that is, it's un-Islamic to not act as such. Yeah. In any event, thank you, Father John, for taking the time, and thank you, Matthew.
John. Or Halal John.
Gentlemen, it's been insightful, it's been an education, and it has been a pleasure. Thank you for your time and your conversation, and be safe out there.
Thank you,
sir.
You too. God bless you.
This has been Crossing Faiths with Matt Hawkins and John Pinna, a podcast of Roll Top Productions. If you like what you hear and would like to help defray the cost of the show, consider sponsoring us on Patreon by visiting crossingfaiths.com. Crossing Faiths is available on all your favorite podcast outlets, including iTunes, Google Podcast, Overcast, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and TuneIn. We'd appreciate your review of our program, especially in the iTunes store. Let us know what you think of the show via Twitter @MTHawk, @JTPinna, or @CrossingFaiths. Music for this episode is courtesy Vajra, whose music is available at thevajratemple.com, Spotify, iTunes, and Amazon. Show notes for this episode and more are available at crossingfaiths.com.